are talking The Last Thing Mary Saw. This one is written and directed by Edoardo Vitaletti and stars Isabelle Fuhrman, who you may know from the movie Orphan, and you've also got a supporting role from Rory Culkin. Now, this is a very, very slow-paced drama horror set in the mid-19th century, and it focuses on this kind of family, somewhat aristocratic family, and they have this 3 generations that are living in this kind of household, and the daughter, Mary, is feeling lustful, shall we say, for the maid, Eleanor, and they are having kind of, you know, somewhat of a relationship. And during this time, of course, the middle of the 19th century, I think it's 1846 or something like that, obviously this is kind of viewed quite poorly, to say the least, and they think that they obviously, of course, there is sinners and all of this, and a very religious kind of household, and they try to essentially do a variety of pray the gay away kind of style things, where they are somewhat abusing especially the maid, but also the daughter as well, to try and re-educate them into their less sinful ways. But things take a little bit of a darker turn, and there is a kind of somewhat of a hint of the occult here as well. What will happen? Well, you're going to have to watch the movie to find out. So, what can I say that works in this film? So this is going to be a film where I think, objectively, it's an extremely well-made film. You know, but it's not maybe a film that I really loved on a personal level for an entertainment value. So this is going to be a case where I can appreciate the film from an artistic sense and, you know, from a well-made sense, but I didn't find it particularly my taste. But let me just say what I think does work well here. I think the whole the feel of this film, the cinematography, is all kind of natural lighting, and we have this kind of like, a lot of it takes place inside, you know, a sort of a dimly lit house, which is kind of by firelight or candlelight, which gives it this kind of soft focus, kind of almost dreamlike, ethereal feel to it through the whole movie, and it always has that kind of that kind of feel to it, which does make it feel quite authentic of the time, I have to say, and also just this has this kind of like really kind of like unique feel and flavour to it, of where it's, you know, it feels somewhat dreamlike, but also somewhat kind of alien and oppressive at the kind of the same time. I have to say, I think the acting here was very good. You know, you're totally buying into the people with these kind of attitudes in this kind of time period. They're kind of, you know, they're absolutely completely intolerant about anything that might not kind of be outside the good book, so to speak. And every single actor, right down from the child actor to the grandmother, I think, who's the kind of like the matriarch, does an excellent job. And let me talk about that grandmother, because I think she was particularly kind of eerie. She reminded me a lot of Kane from the kind of the Poltergeist sequels, and even though those sequels are not as good as the kind of the original, the character of Kane is particularly memorable. And then this grandmother, kind of the matriarch, reminded me a lot of Kane from the Poltergeist sequels, if you know what I mean. The movies, its pace is extremely slow, which we're going to come on to again, but nonetheless, about kind of like, I would say about 35 minutes into it, we get kind of quite a mesmerising scene, which seems to kind of like sort of jolt the movie into more of a kind of a, you know, horror kind of style movie in a way, and kind of somewhat kind of more mystical. And then there's a scene towards the end that is fairly kind of gruesome, and, you know, because the film is so quiet and kind of just more of a dramatic film until that point, it really kind of hits home, and I think really punctuates the kind of like the horror of what is actually kind of happening on screen. And that is because up to that point we've built up to this this fabulous kind of this sequence. I've got to say, I think the music was excellent. I think it really kind of helped. I think that it really accentuates the kind of like this weird sort of creepiness. And on a technical level, this film is just very well made. So, you know, it is technically a great film in regards to the art of cinema. But maybe let's talk about what I think doesn't work. So some of this is going to be more for me. But I have to say, I think this film will be too slow for a lot of people. Unless you are really into the kind of like period dramas and very kind of slow burns. I just think this movie might be a little bit kind of too slow and quiet for some people. And quiet is the operative word, because there's not a huge amount of dialogue within this in this film, particularly in the second half where there's a funeral. The whole family takes a vow of silence for a day, so there's virtually no dialogue really. So a lot of it is kind of done on visuals and stuff like, which they do well, I have to say. But it's just a very, very slow film. And I have to say, I think some people will find it dull. The story is both relatively slight, but also a little confusing at the same time. Because when it comes down to it, there's not a huge amount of like plot twists and stuff like that, and kind of where things are going. It's actually a fairly straightforward story, but within that there are kind of character motivations and things that happen within that. But I have to say, I wasn't fully kind of like understanding where they were kind of going with it at the same time. So I found it both quite straightforward, but also weirdly convoluted at the kind of the same time. So, you know, on a technical level, I've got to say this is a very, very well made film. I personally found it a little bit too kind of slow for my tastes, but obviously if you are interested in the more dramatic kind of movies, I mean, this is barely just about a horror, I would say. It has very, very subtle supernatural elements, and there is a kind of a fairly gruesome scene to it. I would say it just about kind of goes into the very, very kind of gentlest kind of horror category to a point. But, you know, it's just kind of like, if you're expecting a full-on horror, then don't be expecting. So I would say it's comparable in a way to The Witch, and that's kind of like slow period piece. It's not the same story or anything like that, but it has a similar tone to it. It's the most comparable film, I would say, that this movie you can kind of compare it to. So yeah, it's kind of definitely a very well made film, well produced, well acted. But I think a lot of this is going to be down to more of a taste issue than anything else. I do think it's a little bit too slow. I do think they maybe leaned a little bit too heavy onto the kind of like maybe the artistic side, and rather than having more of an engaging story. But it's certainly an above average film, and I think, you know, the kind of the more auteur crowd will kind of like this and stuff like that, and it certainly feels like it will be the kind of like the indie kind of like, you know, cine fans and all of that will kind of get a kick out of it. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. It isn't the most interesting film, I'm not going to lie to you, but as a film, as a craft, it's extremely well made. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to you next time. Bye for now.